Okay, so we're on Samach Vav and Aleph, and I want to go back a little bit to last week's Shiur so that we can
Some,
review and then
I
have
thought it was
kind
some
of.
of Zion Amid Aleph, no?
I'm sorry, what did I say? Samach Zayin of Aleph.
Yeah, you said
Yeah,
some of
yeah.
Vav. Okay.
I'm sorry. Yeah, Samach Zayin of Aleph. So we're going to go back to the words Ara Hadra, which is I guess maybe a dozen lines from the top, the last two words of the line are a hadra, because there we're going to pick up and review quickly and then have the continuity. Otherwise, what we're going to do today won't come together. So the subject matter is what happens when you have a loan, right? You have a loan, uh, or even a sale, and the seller indicates the right to buy it back. So in other words, the sale is going to be somewhat of a conditional sale. And the question becomes, what about the payros, the produce of the land that comes out during, I mean, we had a similar kind of question earlier, but here specifically, the deal was that he had the right to take it back. So if he has the right to take it back, then he can get the money back. And then the question is pay Ramai. So the Gemara asks pay Ramai, what happens to the fruit? Um, and the question there is because you know there's going to be fruit that will be produced. So the Gemara has a havamina ribis kitsut sahava. Is it direct ribis midoraisa? You don't know the amount, but you know that there is ribis, right? Ribis kitsutsa means when you establish at the outset of the loan that you're going to be paying me back, let's say 10%. Okay, that's clearly ribis kitsutsa midoraisa. So you know there's going to be ribis kitsutsa, you don't really know how much. And then the yotzim b'dayanim, which means that if it's ribis kitsutsa, the seller can force the buyer to return the fruit. Or dilma abak ribis hava, or maybe it's nebulous enough that we say no, you can't say it's ribis kitsutsa, the ein yotzin, and therefore you can't get it back. So that's the question becomes how precise we're going to define the term ribis kitsutsa when it comes to this kinds of situation. Okay, so that was the Gemara. Now we had a discussion. Amra Rabba pronounce Mistama Avak Ribis, that in all likely it is avak ribis, because again he holds that you can't define the ribis at the very outset. It's very narrow by definition. The ein yotzin b'dayanim, therefore you can't extract it from dayanim because avak ribis is midrabanan. There's no enforcement mechanism. There is for midoraisa, but there's not midrabanan. So therefore, it's avak ribis. And avak ribis, we said, is the dust of ribis, meaning it sure looks like ribis, but it's not exactly ribis. Because remember, to be with ribis, because of the severity, we define it extremely narrow so that someone shouldn't be over that lot. So if you don't literally meet the characteristics of the exact ribis, it's not the ribis. So it's avak ribis. And Rava says the same. Ki avak ribis have that it's avak ribis, and therefore you can't take it. Okay, that was that case having to do with selling the land and getting it back. Now, Amalei Abaya Rabba. So we said Abaya said to Rabba, Mashkanto Mai. So we're talking the first case, we're talking about a case where he sold it and he says that I want to have the opportunity to buy it back. And then we have this machlekes. What about mashkanta? There was no sale, but he took the property and he pledged it on a deal he was making with the other fellow, right? So now you have a field, which was the mashkin, and the field gives off fruit. So can we draw any kind of parallel to a mashkanta, to a mashkin, from the Gemara we learned before that talked about a sale with a condition to repay? There are different cases, but is there enough there to draw a parallel? That was what the Gemara ends. So asks. So the Gemara says as follows: So now you have to understand, why should there be a connection? Posam tamamai, in the case of the sale, why do we say that it's about ribis, mishum deloy cuts? Because he didn't specifically say 10%. If he would have said 10%, fine, that's ribis katsutza. But because they didn't specifically say, look, the field could have been barren, right? The field could have had no yield whatsoever. Okay, so we don't know if there's going to be a yield or what the yield will be. So it's nebulous. It's amorphous enough that we shouldn't delocates because there's nothing specific about what the ribis is. Then we say you can't. It's about ribis. That's in the case we just said about the sale. What about a mashkanta? So the Gemara says we're going to draw a parallel. Hochinami locates lay. There's also no case. There's also no prearrangement in the mashkanta. So therefore it should be the same result. It should be avak ribis and not ribis indal. Do we say that? That's one way of looking at it. Or Dilma Hasam Zvini, or we can make a chilik not because of the arrangement of ribits, because the first case is talking about a sale, right? And in a sale, there's never ribis gomer, so the best you can have is avak ribis. But in the case of the mashkin was a pledge based on a loan. And when it's based on a loan, then maybe we're saying that the laws of the loan, which of course is the ribis laws, apply. So the fact that you didn't specify what the amount of the ribis will be may be secondary to the fact that it was through a loan where ribis katsutza actually works. Ribis katsutza doesn't work by a sale, it only works by a loan. So do we hang our hat on the fact that it's similar enough because they didn't specify? Or do we say, no, there's a difference between a sale and a loan. So in the case of the sale, you can't have ribis gomer, only avak ribis. And in the case of the loan, you can possibly have avak ribis. And then the question will be, is there enough to suggest that there is actually a ribis deal? Because remember, they didn't go into the specifics of how much and everything like that. So that was the kasha that Abaya asked Rabbah. I mean, he said to him, so what is it? How do you understand it? So Rabbah answers to Abaya, and he says, Amalei, Hosam Tamame, in the case of the sale, which we started out with, so why do we say it's avak ribis, mishum delocates law? So Rabbah is hanging his hat on the fact that there was no specific discussion and amount of ribis. And we need to be very, very specific and narrow. So he's hanging his hat on the fact that Mishum delocates law, because you didn't go into specifics, therefore you can't have ribis gomer, only avak ribis. Hachanami locates law. So Abaya is taking the first position of the discussion. Remember, the first position was that they're similar enough because locates law. The second position was, no, this is a sale, this is a vault. So Rabbah doesn't go into that. Rabbah doesn't say, oh yeah, there's a difference between a sale. Maybe there is. I mean, he doesn't want to touch that. That one is a sale and one is a loan. He says, no, you're right. The bottom line is that there is a similarity because in each case, locates law, you have not had a specific discussion about what the ribis should be, and or if there's going to be ribis. Remember, again, the fact that maybe the field won't yield means that there's potentially no ribis at all, right? And you go back to our Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you can't have ribis. You can't have ribis when there are two alternatives, one of which wouldn't produce ribis. So even if you go with the alternative that produces ribis, it's not ribis because you could have gone the other way. So, I mean, in this particular case, we could have said there's never ribis. Why is there ribis? And it's a barren field. There's no ribis. But so basically, Rabbah answers like the position that it has to do with case. It has to do with making the specific details of the ribis up front. And that's not the case, therefore it's no ribis. Okay, so that kind of sums up the Gemara that we discussed. And okay, make that chiluk. Amar Rav Papi. So Rav Papi says, Avad Ravina Uvda. Ravina was the Rosh Besdin. So Ravina had a case that came before him regarding the sale of the property where the seller had the right to retrieve the property, and that was in the deal, right? So, and that was the case that came before him in Bezin. The Hoshev Apik Peri. So this is very interesting. What did he do? How did he paskin? He said, "You seller sold the land for 100 zuz, let's say 100 zuz, and you want to now you want to redeem it for 100 zuz, but the buyer ate 30 zuz worth. He ate 30 zuz worth of produce during that period of time. So the question is going to become, if he gives them back the 100 zuz, is the 30 ribbis? So here's what the Ravina was a genius. He said, you know what? How much is the payra worth? And he deducted that from the sale so that when the seller said, I want my property back, he only gave him 70 zuz. Why? Because 30 zuz was already consumed in the payras. Therefore, there would never be a ribbis issue, because the ribbis issue only comes up when you get the full amount back and then you have something on top of it. So Ravina said, no, we're not going to do that at all. We're going to go ahead and deduct the amount of the payri, and that will be, and the difference is what you'll pay him. Therefore, we can never have ribbis. So he took the exact measure of how much payri there was, and he took it off the property. So, okay, says the Gemara, Delo Karami Barahuna. And Ravina was, he went against Rabbi Huna. Now, Rabbi Huna was a major Amora that, and what did he say? What did Rabbi Huna just say? That's why we repeated it, because Rabbi Huna said, no, it's avak ribis and you can't collect it. According to the psak of Ravina, of course you can collect it. You collect it in the form of a deduction from the sale. So now we have a machlokes between Ravina and Rav Huna as to whether or not there is the question of ribbis, because according to Ravina, there would seriously be a question of ribbis. If he paid him back, Ravina says, I'm worried about ribbis. So to avoid that question entirely, just deduct it. So he ate 30 zuz, okay, fine, now he pays him 70. So that's what the Gemara wants to show us, and machlokes here between Ravuna, and this is all avak ribbis, right? It's still avak ribbis, but nevertheless, Ravina was makbid, and he said that avak ribbis you can collect. That's the chiddush here, because we would say avak ribbis, it's midrabanan, you can't collect avak ribbis. Comes Ravina and he rules, and he says you got to do it this way, otherwise it's avak ribbis, and you can collect it. So that's the machlokes now between Ravina and Rabbi Barahuna as to whether or not that's a chiddush, because we always assume that the only time you can collect is with ribbis ketsutza. But if it's not ribbis ketsutza, then forget about it. I mean, it's ribbis, but you can't collect it because it's midrabanan. So he is mechadesh that even ribbis to rabbanan, avak ribbis, you can possibly collect. Therefore, to avoid that problem, you go ahead and you void he pays it back, but he doesn't pay him back everything, right? So it's an interesting chap. So that's what we have to understand this Gemara in the context of the machlokes between Ravina and Rav Huna. Now, so pursuant to that machlokes, now the Gemara says, Omar Mar Bereid Rav Yosef Mishpei Rava. The Mar Bereid Rav Yosef says in the name of Rava. Okay, so again, we were talking about a mashkin being a pledge, sort of collateral, we call it collateral to a loan. Hi, mashkanta, ba'asr de misalke. So this opens up a whole other question, which, by the way, is an important question, even on halacha today, because you'll see that we have laws that speak to this. So it's really very germane to this subject. So what was happening? Ba'asar the Misalke, that you make a loan and you say, you pay me back in 6 months. So by saying that you pay me back in 6 months, so the lender has 6 months worth of use of the property, and he knows that it's established, and that's the basis of the loan, right? But what happens where,
What do you mean the basis of the loan? I'm
in
sorry.
other words, I'm making you a loan, Jim, and you're pledging your property, and we make a deal in our loan that you're going to repay me in 6 months. Okay, fine, everything good. Now, in the jurisdiction that we operate in, there's a law that says you can repay me before 6 months, right? Not every jurisdiction would have that. Some jurisdictions, that's why I say it's pertinent to our discussion, because we have rules today in the law that there's no prepayment. You can't prepay. You have a year's, let's say a loan for a year. I'm dealing with something like that. You can't prepay. There's substantial penalties. It's not kedai, so you don't prepay. So in this particular situation, in the locale where this deal happened, there was no objection. There was no bar to the borrower repaying before the term of the loan, right? Okay, that's the situation. Because it could have been a situation where you can't repay. You have to have the loan. But here you can repay. So now the Gemara says, Okol Shiur Zuzeh. So now, so the lender has the property, and he consumes the produce of the property for the amount of the loan. Let's say he lent in Shiur Zuzeh, I say 100 zuz, whatever it is, and he ate 100 zuz worth of produce. By the time the guy came back and said, I want to redeem, he already ate the produce. So what's the thinking here? He already ate the produce. He got his money worth. He got his loan back. What do you do? So says the Gemara, in that case, Meslikin we kick him off the property and we don't repay him. Why? Because he's been repaid through the payers. Who is that like? That's like Ravina. Because Ravina said that the amount, in order to avoid any question of ribis, basically, you can eat, no problem, but what you eat, you deduct. It's like the guy hires the fellow and he says, you're working for me on an hourly basis, and you're harvesting the field. And there's no agreement that he can use the produce from the field. He eats his way through the work. At the end of the day, he says he wants to get paid. And the boss says, you already got paid. You ate your way through the field. So that's the situation here. He misalculate that we get rid of him because he was already paid. That's what Rabbi Yosef said in the name of Rava.
And that was never agreed ahead of time.
It was never agreed ahead of time, but this is a ribis question now. So it's a ribis question, and we just said there's a machlokes between Ravina and Rav Huna as to whether or not according to Rav Huna, we don't worry about ribis, it's avak ribis. But according to Ravina, avak ribis is punishable. Avak ribis you can actually collect, which not everybody holds. So if avak ribis you can collect, then what do we do? So we said you ate, you pay. Now, Aval Tefei, what happens if he ate 110 zuz worth of produce? So he ate more than the amount of the loan. So now we have a dilemma. Does the lender now have to pay him back 10 zuz for the food he ate? So we make a pshara, lo mafkinen binei, that we don't collect because it's a avak ribis. So think about this. Avak ribis is collectible. Why? Because he holds like Ravina. But there's a demarcation between avak ribis for the amount of the loan and avak ribis for more than the loan. If it's the amount of the loan, it's fair square. Here's your property back. You don't owe me anything. I ate the fruit. But if I ate more than the fruit of the amount of the loan, l'chayra, according to this theory, he should be able to collect. Because avak ribis is collectible, according to Ravina. So why is it not collected here? He's saying that it should be collected. He shouldn't have to collect because it's more. So this is the interesting finish here, is that Ravina's halacha is limited only to the amount of avak ribis that is in the deal. In other words, you can't collect more than what the deal is all about. So if the deal is about 100 zuz, and you ate 100 zuz, that's your payment. But so Ravina doesn't go so far. So his is a hybrid. Avak ribis midrabanan, really, maybe you can collect. When can you collect? The amount of the loan. But more than the amount of loan, he'll agree with Rav Huna that it's avak ribis and he can't collect. So that's an interesting twist on Ravina's psak, that avak ribis isn't unilaterally collectible. It's collectible only under certain circumstances. Now, let's go even further. So, okay, so you can't collect it, it's avak ribis. Below machshavin and mishtara l'shara. Let's say, Jay, you and I have multiple business dealings. One of them happens to be this field, but we also have business dealings somewhere else where there's money transacted. Wait a minute. Why don't I deduct the extra amount of avak ribis from the other deal? In other words, if I owe you money from another deal, take off 10 zuz and say that 10 zuz of extra avak ribis is off the other deal. Says the Gemara, below machshivim mishtara l'shara, that Ravina doesn't go so far as to say that you can sort of cross-collateralize and say that one deal is dependent on another. We have this all the time by us, right? Today we buy properties, multiple properties, we cross-collateralize one loan against another loan. If you pay off this loan, fine. If you don't pay that loan off, then you take it from that loan. That's what that's what the business is. He says, but no, we don't hold like that. And why? Because even though you and I are common to all these deals, each deal stands on its own, and you can't cross collateralize. And one more point, but Yasne, in the case of let's say you were dealing with Yisomim, let's say you're dealing with orphans, then Ochel Shira Zuze. If you're dealing with Yisomim, and this particular case rose, Maslikin Lay, Kinon Lay, we kick him out of the field for the amount of the loan. Ochel Tfei, but if he ate more than the amount of the loan, Mafkinim, we do take it from him. In other words, we're machmer by Yisayim, and we do cross-collateralize. So the Gemara wants to tell us that these halachas are the proper halachas in general. But when it comes to Yisayim, we have to protect the Yisayim. So the rules of engagement are different. That in case, if it's one-to-one, no problem. Collect the money. But what happens if he ate more than the share of the loan that we collected from him? And also, we do cross-collateralize and we take from one property to the other. So the Gemara wants to tell us that there is a chumrah by Yisayim because we have to protect the Yisayim. There's no one to protect them. So even though the halacha is that we don't normally do it, but by Yisayim, we do. So that l'chayra is, we see that that's the position of Rabbi Yosef Mishmei de Rava. So he makes this thing. So basically, he's holding like Ravina to the point. He's holding like Ravina in the situation where it's normal between two people, right? That you collect up to the amount of the loan and not more, because Ravina agrees that it's a avak ribis. But when it comes to Yisayim, then that machlokes goes away, and we're more severe. So lest you think that that's the halacha, Amar Rav Ashi says Rav Ashi, Hashda Amrit. Now that you've said Ochel Tzvei, if the lender wound up eating more than the amount of the loan, lo mafkina minei, we don't take it from him. Abel Shia Zuzin Nami Lo below Zuze. So now that you say that if he ate more than the amount, we don't take it from him. So what happens if it's shava b'shava, in other words, the exact amount of the loan was eaten? So he takes now an opposite position, and he says, "Wait a minute. If you can't collect when it's more than the amount, you shouldn't be able to collect when it's the exact amount." What do we say? Well, up to now, we said if it's 1-to-1, you take it from him and you kick him out. But if it's more than 1-to-1, you can't touch the extra amount because it's a bak ribis. Rashi says nothing doing. He says there's got to be an equality here. If he ate fei more than the amount, and we say we don't take it from him because it's a bak ribis, then my feeling is when he ate the exact amount of the loan, also below zuzeh, you can't kick him out without repaying him the amount of the loan. My tama, saluka below zuzeh, apuki minehu. If you kick him off the property without giving him any money back because it's shava b'shava, it's 1-to-1, afuka minehu, then that's the equivalent of how about, so that's the equivalent of taking from him the amount of the value of the produce, a bak ribis, and it's a bak ribis ain't a yotzim b'dayanim. So Rav Ashi is now clearly in conflict with Ravina, and he's flipping it around. He's saying Ravina says that if you take the produce 1-to-1, that's okay. A bak rib, and even though it's a bak ribis, but if it's more than that, it's also a bak ribis, but we give him a pass. Rav Ashi starts the other way around, and he says, if you give him a pass when it's more than 1-to-1, then you can't. Why? Because you're saying it's a bak ribis, and a bak ribis you can't collect. Then Rav Ashi hold, if you can't collect the bak ribis when it's more, you can't collect the bak ribis when it's 1-to-1. Why? Because that would be unfair. How can you take the halacha of a bak ribis and say it works in one case, it doesn't work in another case? So according to Rav Ashi, he's saying that the halacha of a bak ribis is one halacha. You can't split it into two halachas and say sometimes you collect, sometimes you don't collect. So he starts from the point where you can't collect, and therefore, even if it's 1-to-1, you don't kick him off the field without giving him his money back, because it's a bak ribis, and a bak ribis is midrabanan, and you can't collect. So now we have a very clear machlokes between Ravina and Rav Ashi, and also Rav Huna, because Rav Huna earlier said that it's a bak ribis, so it's kind of like 2-to-1, because according to Rabbi Rav Huna and according to Rav Ashi, once you say it's a bak ribis, there's one halacha for a bak ribis across the board. It's only the psak of Ravina who says no, a bak ribis can be split into two. That if it's the amount of the loan, you do collect the bak ribis, and if it's not the amount of the loan, you don't collect the bak ribis. So that's again, this Gemara becomes a little bit it's unclear, because why? In other words, what's the right approach here? Is it all for one for all, or can you split a bak ribis? Because the a bak ribis midrabanan, there's no basis that we see anywhere to say that you split a bak ribis into two, that it's only a bak ribis collectible up to the amount, but over the amount is not. So anyway, So it's avak ribis, any yotzim b'dayam. Okay, so that's the machlokes now between Ravina and the other mandronim. Now let's just go back a minute. We talked before and we said that there's one halacha for everybody else, and there's another halacha for Yisoimim, right? Because Yisoimim we have under our protection, lest you think that is universally held. Over Rav Ashi Uvda. So Rav Ashi here that we're saying avak ribis is one for all for one. There's no chilik in avak ribis. He said the Yisoimim Ketanim, in the event that they were offered minors, Yisoimim Ketanim, then he said that's the halacha. 1 second. So when the halacha, right? So he's now making a chilik, and he's saying the halacha that was brought down in the name of Rava that we protected the Yisoimim is only involved Yisoimim Ketanim, by Yisoimim Ketanim. However, the Gedolim, but by Yisoimim Gedolim, we do not protect them, and he's like everybody else. So he now wants to draw a chilik that when the Gemara said Yisoimim, it meant only Yisoimim Ketanim, and we see that there is some maybe justification for that because in the Torah also the subject of Yisoimim primarily deals with minor orphans, and we have to protect them. Once you're a gadol, then the mantle of being a yosem doesn't have that same sort of severity. Because once you're gedayla, many people Yisoimim. People. What's a gadol? A gadol is someone who's 13 or someone who's 80. So are you going to say that if he's a yosem and he's 80 years old, we protect him because he shouldn't because he's a yosem? No, we don't say that. So only by Yisoimim Ketanim. Right. Okay. So the halacha is that avak ribis by Yisoimim Gedolim is the same as avak ribis by everybody else, and according to Rav Ashi, avak ribis is totally not collectible. So the only Amora who goes against this whole grain is Ravina, who wants to make a chiluk between avak ribis up to the amount of the loan, or avak ribis beyond the loan. And so he's a yochid. He's a yochid. So we don't paskin like him. But the fact is that there is such a position. Ravina was a bezin, I think. So I mean, it's not so pashut that he made that decision. Okay. So this gives us a little bit of an insight on the question of avak ribis. Forget about regular ribis. Avak ribis we know is midrabanan, and therefore, while it is an iser, it's an iser drabanan, but it's not collectible. So it doesn't have the same severity as ribis ketzutza, and again, the theory is in all of these cases is because there's never been any specific discussion of what the ribis should be. This all gets thrown out if we have a discussion. Let's say hypothetically, I lend you 100. I lend you 100 zuz. I get your field, and then you and I agree that I can eat 10% or some hard number of the produce of the field. So now we've negotiated an agreement. We've negotiated an agreement that I can eat a certain amount. So that's not avak ribis now, because now, of course, there may be no yield. Remember, there may be no yield, in which case there wouldn't be ribis. But specifically in this case, where you make that arrangement, then it falls out of avak ribis. So the only reason it's avak ribis because they didn't have a discussion and agree what the amount would be. So once there's a discussion, then the Gemara doesn't say it, but once there's a discussion, l'chayra, it becomes ribis ketsutza, and therefore it's midaraisa, and therefore it's recovered. Okay, so that is this machlokes here between them. Now, so then the question now becomes, with regard to mashkanta. So here we've already talked about mashkanta, which is the focus of our discussion. Omar Rava Bered Rav Yosef Mishrei Rava. So Rava ben Yosef says in the name of Rava, Hi mashkanta. So if you have collateral that you pledge to a loan, Aska the Masalke, and again, what did we say before? That our facts were that it was in a jurisdiction where prepayment was allowed before the due date of the loan. So if the due date of the loan was 6 months, and you came back up to 4 months and said, I want to pay, then the lender has to take back has to give him back the field. Okay. Lo nechel, ella begav yosef. So now he wants to reinforce what we just said. And so what about the produce, right? What about the produce? So lo nechel, so the lender cannot use eat or use the produce of the field, ella begavaisa, only if he made an agreement that if he ate the produce, it would reduce the amount of the loan. So this l'chayra is a raya that to the position that which Rav Huna and Rav Ashi said, Rav Huna, not Rav Ashi, Rav Huna said that you can offset the amount of the loan by the amount that you ate, and he said that okay, so you pay him less. But surah the rabbanon. However, if you're a Talmud Chacham, surah the rabbanon is a Talmud Chacham. Feel the mechleisel neichel. So he goes one step further, and he says that surah the rabbanon, even if you know that there's going to be an offset, which means I can go ahead and eat because I feel comfortable that at the end of the day it'll all come out okay, he shouldn't do it. So this is a Marasayim question. There's nothing wrong with it. We know that at the end of the day you're going to pay back the loan minus the amount that you ate. So there was no this issue, and it's totally transparent. But he says the Shlin Mishur Sadzin that it's Surva Drabanan, the person is a Talmud Chacham, then he shouldn't eat the produce at all, even if he knows there's going to be a reduction in the amount of the loan based on what he ate. He shouldn't eat it. So you see that the Gemara says the Shlin Mishur Sadzin that if you really want to be careful, don't eat the produce if that wasn't part of the deal, because there'll be a question mark hanging over it. And even if you're going to repay it by reducing the amount of the loan, that's still a little sketchy, says the Gemara. So therefore, Tzuvah D'Rabbanan said you shouldn't do it. Frek the Gemara out of the mind, Eichel. So then the question the Gemara asks is, okay, you're telling me that Tzuvah D'Rabbanan shouldn't do it, but we say the halacha that you can do it. So okay, Tzuvah D'Rabbanan is sure sadin, but how can you eat from the produce if you're always going to be constrained because you're going to say, okay, you have to be l'shivin the first sadin. Not everybody is that way, even though we say Tzuvah D'Rabbanan, but Tzuvah D'Rabbanan puts a limitation on, even a lower level of relationship. Okay, we're not Tzuvah D'Rabbanan. Okay, fine. So we make a deal, and the deal is that I lend you 100, and if you eat 30, you'll deduct 30 from the loan. That's the halacha. So if that's the halacha, then Tzuvah D'Rabbanan is Slim Mishur Sadin. It's a little bit of how do you do? Now, if you want to be Tzuvah D'Rabbanan, that's fine. But if not, are you going to be over a lot? Are you going to be over a lot of saying that it's even a vakribis and not ribis, but avak ribis. So how do we understand it? So the Gemara really sort of wants to pierce the veil here and say the halacha is you can do it. You're telling me tzur v'derona don't do it, but the halacha says so. So this is the sometimes the question that comes up is why do we go beyond what the halacha says and do something that is appropriate, but you shouldn't do it. So the Gemara says biketsutsa. So what's biketsutsa? That biketsutsa means that you're, in other words, I guess you would call him a ultra Haredi. Why? Because sometimes we say Kalamaisiv Bereya, that if you go beyond what the halacha says, then it's really reducing from the halacha, because why have a halacha if you're going to allow someone to be more makbid than the halacha? But apparently, in this particular situation, the whole idea of maris ayin, which again we don't talk about it so much because of the halacha, maris ayin shouldn't interfere in the question of avak ribis. But he wants to say that when it comes to a situation where there might be a slight possibility of the appearance of even avak ribis, because you're eating from someone knows that you and I have transacted, and they see that I lent you the money, and I'm sitting in your field and I'm eating an apple, I'm eating an orange. So someone's going to come by and say, wait a minute, they transacted a deal, and he lent him the money. Why do you have a right to eat the fruit? It's ribis, right? Let alone that it's about ribis. Okay, so the halacha says I can do that, but you happen to be tzur v'derabana, and you see that you say, wait a minute, that's not kosher. You shouldn't be touching that at all. You should be either selling it or preserving it for the owner, so that it should all go back to him. So again, the Gemara is showing us a sort of a level of chasidus that even if the halacha is what it is, and that's perfectly fine, there are times when you can actually step beyond the halacha, and it isn't kalamosif gereya. It's not, oh, I'm watering down the halacha because I'm not asking you to do it. You go ahead and do it. It's perfectly fine. The halacha is perfectly fine. But we see people are makbid that there should be no appearance of any kind of ribis by saying, no, I shouldn't benefit whatsoever. And therefore, if I don't take it, then I'm protecting myself, but I also want to give a hasra to the rest of the community. Be careful. So that's pshat b'kitsutza. Okay, but wait a minute. That still requires some understanding. This answer of kitsutza is okay. The man of the kitsutza sharia, who says that you can make such an arrangement that you won't touch it. In other words, you're allowed to touch it, but you and I can transact and said, even though I'm allowed to, I won't. There are some manda omrin who say that it's improper to negotiate a deal that doesn't allow you to eat the fruit. That's to draw a parallel. The Torah tells us that when you're plowing the field, you get wage based on the plow of the field. You can't muzzle your ox so that he shouldn't eat from the produce that is being plowed. It's forbidden. In other words, the ox should have free access. Wait a minute. If the ox has free access, the Torah, that's some kind of a ribis situation. Because you're getting paid hourly to harvest the field, and from that harvest, you should feed your ox. But now your ox is getting something above the hourly rate that you're getting. So and you benefit because you're feeding your ox. So the chayra, that's ribis. So I'm drawing that as a parallel because there are those who saying Lamandam Kitsutsa Asira, that limiting the opportunity for him to take the fruit is an Isser, Ma'ikalamemer. So then, and there is such a Manda Omer that sometimes you say, okay, we say that it's good to be a servant or butter, to be from. You're from, okay, so you don't do certain things that, even though it's allowable. But here you're going overboard. You're going overboard because it's also, according to this Manda Omer, to have this kind of limit on what you can eat from the produce. So the Gemara says, okay, so the Gemara wants to answer that kasha and say as follows. What is Kitsutsa? The Itmar Kitsutsa, regarding what is Kitsutsa, Pligi Bei Rav Acha v'Ravina. There's a machlokes between Rav Acha and Ravina as to what Kitsutsa is. Hadama Kitsutsa Shavia. One Manda Omer says that it's permitted to arrange for Kitsutsa, meaning limitations on what you can take. The Hadama Kitsutsa Asira, and the other Manda Omer says the Chatzitza is forbidden. So you see that even in Kitsutsa, there is a machlokes between the Manda Omer. Okay. Hey, Kitsutsa. So what are we talking about when we say Kitsutsa? The Omalei, okay, you have a Malva and a Love, and the Malva says to Love, at you make a deal at the outset. I am lending you money, and I'm taking this field, and for 5 years, 5 years, I'm going to eat from the produce, right? Below the Chaisa without any offset on the debt. And
Is that considered a good deal?
is that considered a good deal? Right. But he's giving him the money for 5 years. So now he knows that he has a 5 year, and that often has a benefit. I'll allow you certain things, but now I know I have full use of the money and you can't take it back. That allows me to do business, it allows me to do other things. So there is a balance here. It's not just a one-sided thing. But he says, but afterwards, we're going to make a cheshbon of all of the payers that you ate, and we're going to sort of do an offset. In other words, so he's saying at the very outset, eat to your heart's content, but the day of reckoning will come after the 5 years. So
isn't the value of the field calculated? If somebody wants to sell a field, the calculation is based on how much payroll you can get out of the field every year.
And that's an unknown, because you don't know what this field will yield. What happens if it happens to be a field that doesn't yield a lot of payrolls? Not every field is necessarily the same. So then he's going to be out of luck, because he's going to loan on them for 5 years and he'll get barely a scratch out of the field. He won't have the benefits of it. So, but that's the risk he takes. That's why, by the way, it's not ribbis, because there is there's nothing, absolute. Ribbis has to be an absolute. I'll pay you 10%. I'll give you $10, whatever. So, so the Gemara says, so that's the fact pattern. Ikeda Amre, there's another view, that if the parties enter into a loan without making an agreement that the debt is offset by the produce, it's usher. Okay, it's usher, you can't do it.
The contract is usher?
In other words, you have to allow for the possibility that there will be produce, and that produce will offset the amount of the loan. So that's an ikad amr. That's a different view of what it means, kitsutsa, that if you don't negotiate in the deal that this loan will be offset by an amount of fruit, and you don't say that, then he says, okay, that's a different situation. That's not our machlokes. Hey, what is a ketzutza that we're talking about? The omalei. So the lender, the malva, said to the lover, that I'll eat that I will make you a loan and I'll eat the produce for 5 years, and I will take off the amount at the end. And after the 5 years, we'll do a cheshbon, and we'll see exactly how that works. So this whole discussion comes back now to what we said. Surva d'Rabbanan shouldn't even go down this road at all, right? And the answer is okay, but that means that the Surva d'Rabbanan is going to be, but the halacha is you can't. So he says, okay, you can, but with a ketzutza. So what are we talking about now? Manda also becomes according to the man, we have two manda omer. According to the manda omer, who says that a ketzutza, when you negotiate a ketzutza, that means there's very tight restricted benefits, and the debt doesn't get reduced, which means you have to pay the full amount. Shari miras raisa. So according to him, it's allowed to make such a deal where you reduce the debt in the original 5 years, and that would be according to what he's saying. According to that manda omer, even a tzurva d'Rabbanan could do that. So in other words, we're trying to find a way that tzurva d'Rabbanan can also participate in this. And the Gemara says we could ketzutza, that we could ketzutza. We're trying to understand what it means to have that limitation. So he's saying that if you negotiate a deal where there is where the amount of the produce does not offset the loan, then it's permissible even for a tzurva d'Rabbanan, because the facts of the case said specifically that there's no offset, right? So there's no offset, so then there's nothing that the tzurva d'Rabbanan has to do different than everybody else. The manda also b'sraisa, according to the manda over, who says that we're talking about a situation where there is an agreement to reduce the amount of the debt from the eating of the fruit, then that becomes a problem. So it seems that the question of tzurva d'Rabbanan now turns on whether or not you say the deal is it's a straight loan and you have to repay me the full amount of the loan even if you eat the produce, or if the circumstances were that we made a deal, we made a loan, we made an agreement that the amount of produce would be offset from the loan, and therefore you can have the rest. So that seems to be what the machlokes turns on as to whether or not a tzurva d'Rabbanan can benefit. In the one case, he can benefit because there's nothing absolutely wrong. And the second case, not there's anything wrong, but there's no maris ayin, let's just say. But in the second case, it would be maris ayin, and a tzurva d'Rabbanan should avoid maris ayin.
So this case here is almost like an opportunity for the Rabbanim to say, look, we're going to have some standards here. When you make a loan arrangement, any payros that are there, you can or cannot use. If you use them, then this is the rule of deductions that are going to happen at the end. So why did it have to keep staying in this gray area? And there's too many unknowns here how people are going to behave. It'd be much easier to set down some business rules. here. It's puzzling because it can go all over the map,
Right.
and you want to prevent people from signing things that don't make a lot of sense, that protect both sides. So there should have been a standard way to say in these kinds of deals, when you lend the money and you have collateral that happens to be a field, these are the rules, and everybody should have agreed to it.
Right. So you're kind of hinting at the answer. So it's the reconciliation to this machlokes, he says, shari, that just take a look first, that it's permitted, shari, it's allowed. How? Ki mashkanta de surah. In other words, in Surah, in Syria, Surah, this is the way they made the mashkanta. And that was known, so it's called mashkanta de Surah. What is it? Because of Beihofi, because in that mashkanta, the language of the mashkanta is the Mishalim Shnaya Elaine Tepik Ara the Lobakokasa. So what's written in the mashkanta de Surya is, let's say he made him a loan for 5 years. At the end of the 5 years, the lender gives up the land and doesn't get any money back. So that's now the definitive answer as to, so there's no trouble here, because a tzurva d'Rabbanan, there's not going to be any, it's not suspect. We make a deal. I'm lending you the property. I'm lending you money. I have a mashkanta. I have a pledge. The field is basically mine. Remember, there's a quid pro quo because you have the money. I have the land for 5 years. Whatever I get, I may get 2 or 3 times the yield of what the loan is. The loan may be 100 zuz and I'm eating 300 zuz. But I may only eat 50 zuz. So if you make that definitive pledge that after 5 years, the land goes back without any payment whatsoever, then there's no cloud. There's no question. Oh, is there a makribis? Is there something here that you shouldn't do? Remember the whole question by the Tzurva d'Rabbanan is it doesn't look quite right. It's okay halachically, but it's not. It's marasayan. No marasayan. Nothing. The deal. In other words, what the Gemara is suggesting is that when 2 people enter into a deal, they should, and there's a collateral, they should follow the mashkanta de Surya, and they should write into the deal, here you have the loan, I have property. It doesn't have to be 5 years, it can be 3 years, whatever the amount is, and then you get it back without anything. So everybody's taking a risk. I'm taking a risk because I may not even get my value of my loan, but you're taking a risk. You may be giving me 3 times the amount of the loan. But that's okay because everybody's fair and square. I have the money, you have the land. It's as if you have the land now without any restriction, and it's your land. Yes, there will come a point in time when you're going to have to repay me, but that's okay. Then the Tzurva d'Rabbanan, who have this extra, I won't say piety, but this extra chumrah, let's go, they have extra chumrah. Now there's no more chumrah because all bets are off.
Well, the land is the same value. It goes back to the original.
It goes back to the original owner. But we don't know 5 years hence what that will look like. So in other words, there's no specific, oh, if it's worth 3 times as much, you have to pay me, extra money or something like that. It's a totally hands-off deal. You get the land for a certain amount of time. I get the loan. After that, you get the land back, no questions asked. So that's really what it's about. No questions asked, no attachment whatsoever between the parties.
Land can go up and down, and the produce can be yes or no.
Right. So we avoid the question of avak ribis, the plow, and even though we say that there's, in other words, the whole Tzurva d'Rabbanan is because at the end of the day, it looked a little sketchy. It wasn't. The halacha allows it. But you can say it was sketchy because, he's taking something that maybe he shouldn't take. Here, the language of the mashkin made it very clear that there is nothing to be taken. There is no Havamina here. So therefore, the Tzuva Rabbanan can participate without any cloud, and therefore that's how they want to answer it. It's a very sort of complicated way of going back and forth, but we see that there are different ways. Apparently, there are different types of arrangements for loan of property, and in some cases it was attached to the produce. In some cases, it is not. If it's attached to the produce, then in a way it protects the lender, because if the guy makes a loan and there's not much yield, then why should he pay the penalty of not getting anything for the value of his loan, because he didn't take anything back. So that was the whole question here, is how we look at Kitsutsa, and whether or not there was an agreement or not agreement. So the Gemara says, you know what? Yes, there are two different sides here, but the way to get around it is to establish clearly in the shtar what you can do. So the upshot is, we have to understand that even though there are halachas of ribis and all these other things, if you posit clearly in your shtar what the deal is, and it doesn't violate any halacha, you and I can contract anything we want. We can have an agreement that sounds, it may not be economic, but it's not violation of the law. As long as we don't violate the halacha, then we can, and that's what the Mashkanta Desura is. It's a pledge that allows everybody to clearly know what the deal will be after a period of years, and therefore, ultimately, the Tzurba Rabbanan can participate, because there'll be no havamina, so to speak, that there's something in profit. All right, so again, we've come a complete cycle here on understanding what the halacha is on ribis, on peiros, and we're still talking about mashkanta, which we'll pick up next week. But we see that there wasn't like-mindedness. There was certainly machlokes among the Amoraim as to what whether avak ribis is collectible, not collectible, and in order to avoid that whole issue, we're saying that we have to do something that allows for everyone to walk away, and ultimately see the way to do that is the mashkanta desura. All right, so we'll stop here, and